Good day to you all. I'm Kevin May. I'm the editor-in-chief at PhocusWire and your host for today's New Reality With. A very warm welcome to all of you tuning in, and for those of you watching this on the replay from Friday this week. Thanks ever so much for watching this series once again of one-to-one interviews with industry leaders. This series is brought to you through a partnership with Salesforce. Working with them, you can reopen travel with support from Salesforce's work.com. Right, so we've paid some bills. We want to get on with the real show. I'm delighted this week to welcome Elliott Ferguson. You are the CEO and president of Destination D.C, District of Columbia, for those that perhaps don't know, which is, I think it's fair to say, one of America and perhaps one of the world's most high-profile kind of tourism organization, DMOs, tourism boards, depending on how you define it. So, Elliott, thanks again ever so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time here in this mid-September, very sunny weather here, as it looks like it is for you.
Hey, Kevin, thank you very much for having me. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's really nice weather outside here in the nation's capital. Happy to be with you.
Right. So what we've been doing with these series of interviews, Elliott, is we started them back about 15 weeks ago, right when people were still dealing with a lot of the initial outbreak. And we were trying to get a sense of what organizations, whether they were airlines or hotels or online travel agencies or airport tech providers, whatever, how they kind of got a grip with things as stuff started to really unravel in February and March in the US's case. But we sense that we've moved on a little bit now. Everyone's kind of heard all the stories about how everything shut down, and we're really into that kind of looking forward kind of perspective. And that's really what we want to kind of get your perspective on today. So I'll start things off, Elliott, by asking you this really. I mean, what would you say at the moment is the role of a tourism organization when we are still, I would say, kind of mid-pandemic? What are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, any tourism organization, our primary goal is economic development, and it's really tied to having individuals come to our great city, spend money, stay in our hotels, or bringing large congresses to the city, neither of which are happening in significant capacity at this point. So, you know, we're trying to be as positive as we possibly can as we look at what's going to rebound first, what's not going to rebound, and equally as much, what should we be focusing on as a destination. And about 2 weeks ago, we had what we call our annual marketing outlook meeting, which is the lead into our marketing plan for the next year. And as you can imagine, we had a significant number of people that were on really focusing on, you know, everything that we're saying. What are we going to be doing to promote DC and help us rebound during and post COVID?
Now, I would hazard a guess that it's probably quite hard to make any kind of solid plan for anything perhaps looking into the next couple of months, let alone into 2021. So how do you as a tourism organization actually kind of wrap your head around planning for something that is potentially still a very, very fluid situation?
Yeah, Kevin, everything right now is you know, I'm really calling 2021 in terms of our planning a hybrid. You know, we had to react in 2020 because we were already in our annual year. But as we're looking at planning for next year, I basically am doing things on a quarterly basis. You know, as things reopen, you know, fortunately we're in phase 2 of potentially 4 phases for the U.S. and for Washington, D.C., which means 50% of occupancy in restaurants. We're seeing more and more venues opening in the city. The fact that, you know, D.C. is one of those towns that you can come to, and if you're memorials, monuments, outdoor activities, you can do that and socially distance. So now that individuals are at a point where the shock of it all, we're still dealing with it. We have a grasp on how to deal with it, but now people are willing to get out and explore more. We're focusing on the fact that the value added of coming to a city like DC with 16 free museums, the zoo is free, 16 free that are part of the Smithsonian, but others that are also free, and that will be reopening, and the fact that you can still have a great dining outdoor experience and enjoy the city as a whole. So that's what we're focusing on as we're looking at still being in phase 2, but potentially going into phase 3, hopefully in the next 30 to 60 days, if we're lucky.
Yeah. You said there, a lot of your attractions or landmarks, points of interest are outdoors. Have you
Yes.
as an organization worked with those particular landmarks and things to organize their social distancing, or is that done at a kind of a city government kind of level, or if it's something that you've worked with them on?
Yeah, anything tied to the actual pandemic and or processes that are in place, we've been relying heavily on our health department here in Washington, D.C. and our mayor to set the standard, working with the Center for Disease Control, which is headquartered in Atlanta, and others that are really focusing on this pandemic. I think the reality for us, Kevin, is that there's nothing about the pandemic that we can control, but what we can do is share information about the safety programs and protocol that are in place, such as mandatory to wear a mask, social distancing, and sharing whatever the criteria is in terms of going to different places in Washington, D.C. So we're communicating as best we can with our website, through our website, washington.org, simply because we want individuals coming to Washington to know what's expected.
And a question that we asked a lot of the people that we've had on this show, I think this is the 16th one that we've had, that we stopped asking because we always got the same answer. But I'm curious because you're the first tourism organization that we've had. In every organization, whether it's a corporate entity or a supplier airline or something, should have some kind of disaster or crisis planning.
Right.
That they look at. Is this something that you would this kind of thing that we're involved in, is it something that you had ever kind of planned for or managed to get your heads wrapped around if something had happened on this scale? I mean, obviously, unfortunately, Washington and DC has been the attacks on the Pentagon in 2001. So you've had those kind of terrorist attacks, but something on this scale is very different.
Kevin, it's a very valid question. I think that you do your best to prepare and engage in a way that allows you to be as prepared as possible. I've been in DC for 19 years. Yeah. And, I remember very vividly about 9 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, we were doing disaster preparedness, be it a hurricane and or a terrorist attack, or all the things that the world has to deal with. And we left that training, and a few hours later, we had a earthquake. We didn't do training for an earthquake because, who would think there'd be an earthquake in Washington, D.C.? To your point, this hasn't happened since 1918. It's a long time ago. And I think that, from our perspective, there was no training that was done outside of the fact that airlines have always had safety protocol in terms of air standards and quality. And now, of course, hotels are ramping up and doing things a lot differently. And the irony is that you're going to see, in addition to me sharing with you why you should come to my hotel or eat in my restaurant, you're going to equally see more information about what protocols I have in place, because arguably people will be more interested in that as they're making a decision as to where to go, where to stay, what cities to visit. So, the protocol of safety has probably taken more of a priority than ever before.
Right. And I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but it's an important part of what's happening this year, and presumably would have been an important part of a destination's planning. And that's you have a presidential election coming up in November. I mean, how do you, as a destination management organization, kind of in this mid-pandemic period, kind of deal with that? Because there are presumably still going to be many people that come along regardless of what happens, without going into detail about the actual election itself.
No, we won't talk about that. But let's just say that, to your point, the reality of where we are as a country and globally is that things change constantly, and so there are a lot of scenarios that might play an active role in how marketable and how appealing an inauguration will be in Washington, D.C. We already see we had the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. That was done by Dr. King in 1963. That was done a few weeks ago in the city, and you didn't have the significant number of people that would have come in a pandemic, but you had a significant number of people that came. We've seen other events that have happened in the city whereas you've seen people that have come. So the reality is people will come, and if they follow the protocol, and let's just face it, the election is not even 2 months away, or maybe 2 months away, but the inauguration is 4 or 5 months away, and so many things can change within that period of time.
Yeah.
And so we're cautiously optimistic because from an economic perspective, it's a huge infusion to the economy in Washington, D.C. to host the inauguration. So as you can imagine, we want it to be what it normally is every 4 years, but we realize that it will probably be compromised based on where we are with finding a cure for COVID.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on a little bit then. I'm interested just almost kind of conceptually now, less about Washington, D.C. or Destination D.C. I just want you to kind of get your thoughts on the evolving role of DMOs and destination organizations and things like that. I mean, traditionally, and I know there are very, very different examples all around the world. I mean, traditionally, the destination marketing organization was to get people on the plane and do all the pre-marketing for them and just get them in the destination. And that was kind of it. And I know I'm being very, very simplistic here, of course, but that is essentially still their role, is to get people into the destination. How, for you, do you think that is going to evolve as we start to look into 2021, whether it's due to the pandemic or just the evolution of what your organization's responsibility is anyway?
Yeah, for us, it's always and traditionally been about heads and beds and butts and seats. And, that, to your point, will still be a large part of what we do because, we're talking about the economics of visitors into your city, which a city like London, a city like Washington, it's a big deal. I think the reality for us, and we continue even before this pandemic, to question what should we be doing differently, be it a leisure traveler or the meetings market, which we do a lot of large congresses in the city. And to the point that was made earlier, it's all about consumer confidence. Right now, DC is doing fairly well in terms of the pandemic and the fact that we don't have this many cases. I'm sure wherever you are in the world, you're hearing different things about other parts of the U.S. So the question that we are asking ourselves is that how do we make sure that individuals that live in Washington, Maryland, and Virginia, because we're flanked by both of those states, remain safe when they're coming to work in Washington, D.C., just as much as we're thinking along the lines of those that are coming to visit. So you're going to find that a lot of the things in which we're sharing in terms of coming to Washington, D.C. is the reassurance that Washington has mandatory protocol in terms of going into buildings that are tied to wearing a mask. So if you're global, and we know that the global community is compromised in terms of being able to travel to the U.S. right now, but when that does change, there will be no question as to the fact that even if you saw an event, a rally or something that's done somewhere else in the U.S. and people are not wearing a mask, that is not an option in terms of coming to Washington, D.C. So we're going to see a lot more safety protocol and consumer confidence building as a part of our marketing as we look at moving forward.
What is Washington or Destination DC's kind of role in connecting all the dots, as it were? So having a relationship and thinking about the relationship that it has with hotels and attractions and tying that all together, or is it often kept in individual kind of silos?
Yes and no. But I mean, to answer your question, we're a membership-based organization. So anyone and every type of organization that could potentially benefit and or play a role in visitors coming to the city, be it business travel, conventions, or the leisure market, they're more than likely members of our organization. Now, in saying that in one breath, different components and segments of membership require different things. And from our perspective, we all know that it starts with a person physically staying in a hotel, only from the standpoint that someone staying in a hotel in DC, the economic impact of that visitor is going to be much larger than the economic impact of someone that's staying in Maryland or Virginia. So therefore, we're closely focusing on that as it pertains to the potential of visitors coming to Washington, D.C. So That's extremely important as we look at what the city is expecting. You're talking $900 million in taxes generated by visitors coming to the city, 79,000 jobs, $8 to $9 billion generated overall by the industry. So that's a big deal, and one of the fastest growing economic engines in terms of generating new job growth in Washington. So everyone's paying attention to that and wanting to know, how does the slowdown? Well, if they didn't understand the impact of tourism before, they definitely understand it now. I would say that would be a global response. So therefore, in our space, the expectation is, what can you all do, Destination DC? Because we're not part of government. We're a private organization.
Yep.
What can we do for our members to bring back those visitors? And the reality is that normally, we are looking at charts and graphs and data and saying, well, this is how it took us 10 years to rebound after 9/11. This is a new frontier for us. And so we know that once we have I said cure earlier, but I should have said a vaccine for COVID, then we anticipate seeing faster growth in terms of visitation to the city. If it's not until 6 months, we're still going to see growth in terms of people coming and using the protocol tied to being in a hotel, getting on an airplane, and going into any of the public space or private space that exists in Washington. And our members have different needs, and they're looking for us to make sure we're communicating to those potential visitors as to what to expect.
What do you think a DMO can do better in terms of those relationships that it does have with hotels and maybe even fellow tourism boards that are around maybe at a regional level?
Well, I think that any DMO that doesn't recognize the fact that we all have to be chameleons, they're going to be lost in the shuffle, and they're not going to be serving the best interests of their members. And what that means basically is that we cannot do, whatever we did in 2019, and this is a good example, 2020, we have to continue to change and understand the dynamics of a changing market. So DMOs that are always looking for visitors coming from a particular area and not understanding the dynamics of travel from that area, be it economics, war or whatever, they're going to be lost as we're looking at the growing economy. For example, in the U.S., we've been playing more of we have been more actively involved in bringing international meetings, MICE meetings, to Washington, D.C.
Yep.
But we've only been doing that for 15 years. So those who are just joining getting on that bandwagon because their community did not think that international meetings were important, then they're behind the eight ball. So our job and the goal for us is to always find ways to be ahead of the game and to offer services above and beyond saying, come to Washington because we're great. Now let's go after the next group or the next group of visitors. We have to do more. We have to offer more and be more tailored in how we promote our city, because one size does not fit all.
In my research for this interview, I was looking up, various both academic and industry kind of reports on what perhaps the future role for DMOs are going forward, despite what's happened this year. And there are some common threads in these. Some of these ideas, and one is for DMOs to get kind of more involved in product design with kind of the partners, with the attractions, with the points of interest and things like that, rather than being solely a marketing organization. So it's almost, it's a terrible word that gets used a lot. It's, a holistic approach to it a little bit more. And I wonder what your kind of perspective is on that, because that is a subtle change from a marketing organization to actually being there on the ground, as it were, as a design type, product design type organization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that in a case like ours, and I will say that before I answer this question, again, one size does not fit all. So what we do for a city like Washington, what London does is not the same thing that Bath, England will do for a variety of reasons, infrastructure, what have you. So every destination has to do something differently. We look at the industry that we have that's evolving in the area, as we've become more of a high-tech corridor for a long time. And still we are seen as the seat of government for the U.S. which is true. So therefore, with that comes a lot of ancillary business that is in the greater Washington area because of the federal government that is here. But we're also looking at other facets of industry that are investing in the region, and how can we utilize and find ways to capitalize on what they're bringing to Washington. For example, with Amazon building their second headquarters outside of Washington State in our backyard, what does that mean in terms of us marketing to those individuals that are coming in for business to bring their families and enjoy Washington, not just come in for a business trip and just leave. And the list goes on and on as to how we are looking at going after business. The meetings market is totally different, but our approach is different as well. It's not just come to Washington and we'll help promote it a little bit more. Now we're teaming up with, here's the industry that's in Washington, D.C. Here are some of the speakers that you can have at your meeting without having to pay for them to come in from other places because they're so, and here are the universities that are here. The list goes on and on and on in terms of how we're pursuing our role as economic engines for the city through those that are coming to Washington for 3 to 5 days.
Do you think there is even an opportunity for DMOs to become operators, almost tour operators in their own right? Or is that something that you would prefer to kind of steer clear from? And I'm just reeling off some of the kind of the theories about the way the model could actually develop over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you're in a city, whereas a service does not exist, and you recognize the fact that that service can play a large role in growing your economy through the leisure market or meetings market, then I would encourage it. Yep. If that is not the case, like in Washington, because we have so many members, we don't want to step on the toes of our members. We want to help them to grow their market base, which is why they pay us membership dues. So it really depends on who where you are and what is the capacity, or if a service is actually offered in your destination. For a long time, destination management organizations, which we're called, ran visitor centers. Yeah. We don't run a visitor center, but there are visitor centers in Washington, D.C. The dynamics of all that have changed and evolved. The evolution of tech and smartphones kind of made us question whether or not it was necessary, especially since there are opportunities for visitors to come to Washington and still have that same experience. We don't need an official visitor center through our DMO. In another city, that could be totally the opposite.
Right. So do you put a lot of effort into kind of digital communications then, like apps, and the website is very thorough? I've been exploring that, rather than, as you say, the visitor center, which is just, you got to have people there and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the visitor center experience can be really cool. If you have a coffee bar, if you have the dynamics that will attract people beyond brochures. But for us, even an app, I mean, nowadays, like when apps were all hot 10 years ago, everyone wanted to download an app. Now you've got too much stuff on your phone. And so you're not going to download an app for a city. So our website is responsive design, which runs just like an app. I mean, so you have to pay attention to the dynamics. I can't tell you the number of people and stakeholders in Washington that said, why don't we have an app? And we do that research because I'm like, and you have to be mindful in how you answer that. I'm like, okay, you go to the city and you are wanting to learn more about the city. Are you going to download an app? And then there's the credit card data. Are you going to put your credit card in? The answer is probably no. As a matter of fact, you have so much stuff on your phone nowadays. You have pictures from 2005 on your phone. You don't have the room for another app. And so we're paying attention to those variables and making sure that we have things that people can actually use.
Okay, I wanted to come back to technology and some of the kind of the more smart city type things in a moment, but I also wanted to touch on issues around the diversity agenda in travel and tourism hospitality. You spoke to my colleagues at Travel Weekly US a couple of months ago, and this is a quote you said: "I'm one of the very few at this level that look like me. I've been in several environments where I am not considered to be the CEO of the company because of that. those are some of the softer scenarios that I've had to deal with. Softer, I think, was because the wider conversation was about the events that took place over May and June in the US. I mean, how do you see broadly, as as someone who commentates and offers your perspective on this issue quite regularly, Elliott? I mean, how do you see the travel industry kind of taking on these issues on a kind of a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being non-existent and 10 being it's a fuller-throated approach to things and it's doing a great job in driving the agenda forward?
Well, there's no one that's doing that. I think in 2019, I'd give it a lower mark than I would give it in 2020 because of more of a reaction, more of an awareness, more of a reaction from not just the Black community, but from white community, from a generational perspective, and from corporations out of necessity. So, the reality is, as you're, I know that we have a global audience, and sadly enough, sometimes the global audience has a better grasp on some of the racial history in the U.S. than people that live here, and that's part of the problem. That's a whole nother conversation, and that's a 2-hour conversation, if not longer. But the reality is now, we all feel more responsible. I feel more responsible in terms of what I have done, or equally as much perhaps what I haven't done up to this point, now that I've run an organization and I happen to also chair the U.S. Travel Association.
Yeah.
I think that what has happened in America, not just with the death of George Floyd, but over and over in terms of the racial divide, is something that came to a critical impasse this year, in addition to the pandemic. And we are now probably being more vocal and more adamant about change, because this, the specific to the hospitality industry, there's diversity at the lower end, lower rung of the scale. But as you look at the pyramid, you get fewer and fewer people of color, Black people, Latino, LGBTQ, and the list goes on and on. And that has to change. But at the same time, we're also saying we have to recognize that there are issues with bias and racism in America that exists, and we recognize it because we deal with it, we live with it all the time. But white America also has to recognize it and has to be a part of that conversation, and if we're really going to see the change that's needed.
Do you sense, Elliott, that your role as probably one of the most senior Black CEOs in the industry, almost, that just happens to be Washington D.C., that your role is enhanced because you are, or your responsibility to kind of also do something for the agenda is enhanced or more politically charged because of the city that you actually represent as a DMO?
Well, it has less to do with the city and more to do with the fact that I've been in this industry for 30 years, and I know 30 years ago, had I said what I am saying now, I probably would not be in this industry, because white America would have said I was disruptive. White America would not have felt comfortable, and people don't want to have these types of conversations. The point that you're making was, my revelation is that, hey, you know what? I am in a position of power, and if I don't do more now than I have been doing, perhaps arguably I could not do it before, but now I am empowered to do it, then it's my responsibility. And it's not just for the Black community, but it's for all communities in the U.S., because we do have, like many countries, we've got issues with racism and bias and other issues that need to be dealt with. And we have to hold CEOs responsible and accountable to look at their staff, look at their board of directors, look at their membership, and have prerequisites in place that are tied to equality. Because if not, we can no longer have these ebbs and flows, whereas we're talking about it, we're outraged on Monday, and by Friday, oh yeah, we're not talking about it anymore. And I think that's the goal for me as I'm looking at my role and being a part of this conversation.
And lastly on this, if we can, I mean, you talked about strategies in place by travel brands to be more inclusive and diverse. I mean, what is Destination DC's own policy and strategy around making your own organization more diverse?
Well, here's the deal. Usually when you have diversity in an organization, let me rephrase that. When you have leadership that recognizes, or if that leader happens to be Black or Latino,
yep,
usually that organization is going to have that level of diversity. So I look at it in everything that I do, not just from the standpoint of being a Black male, but also from the standpoint of being in a very diverse city that has, 190 embassies and people represented from all over the world. And not every Black person you see is a Black American. It could be a Black person from Jamaica, a Black person from the UK, Black person from Africa. Understanding the true dynamics of our city and making that a part of my role on a regular basis. But my eyes are open. And that's the whole thing that we're saying to the leadership, be it in the DMO space or the major corporations, is that without that diversity in places of power, you're missing the boat. There are a lot of studies that basically state that those organizations that put diversity as a priority, not because they're checking a box, are probably more profitable, because you're going to have someone who's going to look at something and say, well, wait a minute, you've got this amazing ad campaign, and there's not one Black person, one Latino person, and if people don't see themselves, then you're going to shoot yourself in the foot in terms of being able to attract those individuals to your destination or to your product. So we always do that. Washington, D.C. is known as Chocolate City, a city with a primarily large Black African-American population for a long time. There's much more diversity now, but still there is a very strong Black community here with a lot of history. So I'm always going to pay attention to that history and make sure that it's part of our marketing. But I guarantee you, my peers don't do the same thing because they're not paying it. They don't see it as a priority. And that's part of the conversation that we're having.
Now you maybe inadvertently or not, but one of my next questions was, we were going to go back into talking about marketing for DMOs and using people of color in the creative output, but you've answered it very eloquently, so I need to cross that one off my list. I mean, sticking with marketing though, if we can, Elliott, I mean, there are the classic, as we say, kind of marketing techniques for DMOs. I mean, how do you sense that is going to evolve over time, whether it's new types of media channels or new types of channels within the digital realm? I mean, where do you kind of put your focus and start kind of unraveling things in spite of what we're doing at the moment with the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that now more than ever, because everyone's budget, including mine, they're all compromised. So I'd love to do advertising, but I don't have the budget to do it. So I'm looking at those creative options that are out there. So we've been very much so involved in our website design and other avenues that allow us to have a voice, be it our hashtag .com, our hashtag tied to recovery from this pandemic, and our access into the international market, especially in Asia, whereas things like Facebook are not an option. So we're actively involved in the options that exist in those other countries for obvious reasons, because in those countries, the citizens there, they're not necessarily looking at advertising in the same vein. I'm not saying no one is, but they're going to their apps. They're trying to find new ways, or they're not necessarily on television all day long watching TV. They perhaps could be paying attention to what's happening in the world through an app. And we want to be there promoting our city and engaging them as well. So that's a huge part of what we're doing. But as I say to the team, don't get too comfortable because as we've seen over the last 20 years, who's on top on Monday could be out of business by Friday. And we need to also be in lockstep with whatever is happening that's attracting the market in which we're going after.
How much marketing, or maybe none at all, do you do in conjunction with the attractions and the landmarks and points of interest that are in Washington, D.C., which are numerous and very varied?
Absolutely. The interesting thing about them is that most of, like the Smithsonian's, for example, which, by the way, was founded by an Englishman, John Smithson, They have no budget for marketing. They're part of the federal government. So therefore, my organization is it in terms of promoting all that Washington has to offer. As much as we love our monuments, memorials, and museums, it's equally as important. And the reason why our whole campaign, Discover the Real DC, DC Cool, exists is because people come here and say, I had no idea DC was so green. There are two amazing rivers that people kayak and boat on. And, it's easy. 700,000 people live in DC. People are shocked. They think that millions of people live here. And the history of this city, these are things in which we work on promoting as a part of our marketing, simply because we don't want to be pigeonholed as just a city to come for a memorial or to see. I have the Obama portrait behind me. The National Portrait Gallery is down the street with all the presidents hanging, and of course the Air Force memorials behind me. We want them to come for those things, but we want them to discover other things while they're here.
Now, it's interesting, though, because there is a sense, because travel is so restricted, certainly here in Europe, there are borders closing and opening all the time and quarantines in place. And a lot of the focus has been on domestic tourism. And if we take that to a more micro level where you are, this is kind of in-city tourism. I mean, how many are you actually trying to reach out to your own citizens of the city to almost remind them that they, on their doorstep, are these amazing museums and amazing monuments? Because certainly that's what's happening here in London. We're all being encouraged to go and see our own places. I mean, that's presumably quite a significant change to what you're normally doing.
Well, it is, but it isn't, because during the, everyone has peak seasons, but during our off-peak seasons, we've always promoted basically staycations. Those, people that live out in suburbs, similar to the UK, to London, come into the city, check into a hotel. The lines are, you don't have as much traffic during the winter months. Enjoy the city, enjoy a sporting event. So we've been doing that for a long time. But to your point, with the pandemic, realizing that the international market is not going to be traveling for a few months in the same numbers that we were experiencing, that, we're fortunate that about 50 million of the U.S., 50 million people within the U.S. population live within a 250-mile drive. Right. I don't know what that is in kilometers, but at least 4 hours of Washington, D.C. So our marketing is going to be tied to that drive-in market, which is pretty substantial. Those who perhaps their budgets have been compromised, coming into a city where you can do a series of things for free. You can get a really great deal on a hotel room, and you can eat in a great restaurant, and you're not breaking the bank because the bank has already been compromised. So that's going to be a large part of our short-term marketing plan for obvious reasons.
Yeah. And often the following cities are mentioned in the same breath, and it's Barcelona, it's Venice, Amsterdam, sometimes Prague, and places like that. Don't often hear Washington, D.C. mentioned in the same breath of those when the subject of over-tourism comes up and things like that. I mean, is that because you have largely managed to manage tourism or manage visitor numbers, or is it just by virtue of the way the city is that you haven't had that crazy influx of visitors coming in?
Yeah, no, I mean, we call it tourism management. And the reality is, Washington was built in the 1700s by a Frenchman. So a lot of people don't realize you come to Washington, D.C., and one of the biggest compliments we get on a regular basis is that it reminds them of France. But it was also built for horse and buggy, not for cars. So with that, there are always concerns about the buses and the number of visitors in the city. And how do we manage it? Tourism management is a big deal for us. To your point, it's not the same as going into the city like Venice, which is extraordinary, or London for that matter. And it could take you 45 minutes to go 2 miles of driving, which is why even when I'm in London, I take the tube. It's just easier. We're not there yet, but it is something that we're always concerned about from the standpoint of our environment and the standpoint of the experience of individuals that physically live here. So we do monitor it. We're not where those other cities are, even though we're still a very small city in terms of the number of kilometers of Washington, D.C. So we realize that even though it's not a big brouhaha right now, it can easily be one in 5 to 10 years, because my job is to bring more visitors to the city. So how do you do both? Come to the city, but don't come. So the goal is to try to bring more visitors to Washington during those off-peak times. So hopefully that will alleviate some of the tourism during the Cherry Blossom Festival, where millions of people come to Washington to see the cherry trees bloom in the spring.
Yeah, so it's doing it in a smart way, essentially, isn't it?
That's what we're attempting to do. Do it in a smart way. Restaurants and hotels don't want to hear that. They want 100% occupancy year round. So it's not
that's a difficult thing for you then. As you look into hotels especially are going to be desperate next year,
Yes,
especially to get as many people in, because they've had such a rubbish 2020.
right.
And what you don't want is lots of people to come to DC in 2021 and actually have a pretty poor experience because everything was crowded. Hotels were full. The hotels are over the moon and really happy, but the overall experience may be tainted. So that's a difficult thing for you to kind of have to manage, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's something that we, even as we look at all the free museums, one of the things in which we've said to several of them is that you're going to have to go to online timed entrance, simply because you're going to have limits in terms of the number of people that can physically be in your establishment during COVID. And but you don't want 5,000 people showing up, whereas you normally can cycle through those 5,000 people in an hour in a non-COVID environment. And in this environment, people standing in line for 3 hours. I'm going to have an awful experience. I'm going to talk about how bad that experience was. And that's not what any city wants. So we're all paying attention to how do we manage the expectations of visitors during this, during the times in which we're in. To your point, everyone's going to want 100% occupancy next year. And I think now more than ever, even the cities, Barcelona, Venice, Amsterdam, Prague, the ones you referenced, they're all looking at the economic impact of visitation, especially since it's not happening, and what that means for their cities from a standpoint of the, from economic development. So it's a catch-22.
Yeah, I heard it put a little bit more bluntly quite recently from somebody who said the pandemic was probably the best thing that could happen for over-tourism, because social distancing immediately creates a little bit more distance between tourists. Would you be happy to take an audience question?
I absolutely would.
Okay, so the attendee says, I'm wondering what type of platform technology Destination DC uses as a DMO to pull together different players across the ecosystem, content providers, distributors, to ensure they can push consolidated marketing messages out to all the players.
Wow.
If you don't know offhand, we'll ask them to ping their email over on the chat.
Yeah, we use primarily, we use different platforms for different audiences. I mean, that's kind of the reality. When we're dealing with China, we're using the platforms that are accessible in that particular market. So there's just not one easy answer, and we're always evaluating what's out there, what's smarter, what's the most user-friendly, for obvious reasons. So we continue to evolve out of necessity in terms of what makes the most sense for us. We get a lot of companies that reach out to us that want to present. I send it all to our senior vice president of marketing, and then they present to me if we need to change direction, and equally as much how much that will cost and what the return on investment will be.
And I mean, you seem very, maybe upbeat is the wrong word, but hopeful that you have enough things in place that you can almost kind of like building blocks to a recovery. I mean, and how do you sense this kind of next year is going to kind of pan out for you? I mean, you've talked in detail about various things, but just overall, Elliott, I mean, it must be either probably a combination of slightly worrying, constantly having to shift strategy. I mean, you said quarter by quarter, but I mean, how do you kind of look ahead really at almost at a personal level about how you need to kind of get your head around it all?
Yeah, Kevin, there would be nothing worse than a sales and marketing guy with a totally negative outlook all the time. So the word that I'd like to use.
Well done on that then. Yeah.
You know, I'm very optimistic. I mean, you know, the reality of, you know, the city that you live, the city that I represent, a lot of cities is that, you know, people want to travel. You know, they want to get back out there. So it's not as if we will not rebound. It's going to take a long time to rebound, and certain segments will rebound much faster than others. But I remain optimistic because I think that we have the opportunity to be optimistic as people are now being more mindful of the fact that you don't have to physically quarantine indefinitely as we did in the beginning out of necessity because we knew so little. The more we learn, the more adaptable we will be, and we'll be able to accommodate travel to a certain extent. You know, in March, April, perhaps I would not have gotten on a plane. But in September, I would get on a plane because I understand a lot more, and therefore there's an opportunity to be more optimistic. And we're seeing that in the travel trends of individuals who are eager. They're calling us and saying, when are these things opening? I'm ready to come. We're sick of being at home. We may not get on a plane, or maybe we will, because I'll tell you, air travel is safer now more than ever. Always really has been. And we need to be optimistic as we're looking at those opportunities ahead of us.
So what would you say then? I mean, you've learned that, you know, as you said, Elliott, air travel is safe or safer. And, you know, we've learned how the coronavirus spreads and how to lock down specific areas or communities when there are mini outbreaks, as is happening here in the UK. But I mean, what would you say is the biggest thing that you've learned personally that you are going to use in the way you manage a DMO going forward? This is your last question, and then I'll let you go.
All right. Well, you know, I think that you just don't get too comfortable is the thing that I've said that to the team all along. And I hate to be the "I told you so" guy, but this is probably the extreme of what that means. You know, everyone is trying to get a piece of the pie. Right now, we're all trying to climb out of the unfortunate circumstances of something that's happening that's killing people. So you keep it all in perspective. And once we're beyond COVID, just be prepared for the next disruptor, because it could be economics or something else, but there will be something else, Kevin. And I think that's kind of the reality of any business model, is just be prepared and make sure your team understands that and is ready to be engaged and perform accordingly.
Okay, so we've come to the end of another New Reality with. First of all, we'd like to say thanks to Elliott Ferguson for joining us. Also, we'd like to thank our partner Salesforce for working with us on these one-to-one interviews, looking into the second half and into 2021 and beyond. Embark on a safe new era of travel with Salesforce CRM. More details about Salesforce and the CRM are available on the article that will accompany the replay. So just from me, Elliott, thank you very much for joining us. Keep disrupting. I think you said that was one of your roles when we were talking about 15 minutes ago. So please keep doing that. It's been fascinating talking to you. And thanks ever so much for joining us on New Reality with. Really appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, Kevin. Have a great day.